Human carried an alien girl across the loose shale. Her gentle gesture later spoke beyond victory. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to the main character. Ethan Walker had always been a man who valued action over words. As a seasoned survivalist, he was accustomed to the wild terrains of Earth. But nothing could have prepared him for what lay ahead. The mission was clear: retrieve the alien girl and bring her to safety, a task that seemed almost too simple on paper. However, the reality was far from straightforward. The landscape was unforgiving. Loose shale stretched endlessly across the horizon, the jagged rocks threatening to shift with every step. Ethan, a man with pale skin and rough hands from years of outdoor labor, found himself unsure whether he was more nervous about the terrain or the unknown creature he was supposed to protect. Her name was Lyra, and she was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin was a soft, pale greenish hue, almost translucent in the harsh light of the distant sun. Her long silver hair shimmered as though it held the light of distant stars. Her eyes were luminous, glowing faintly in the dim light of the alien planet. But despite the awe her appearance inspired, it was her fragility that concerned Ethan the most. She was injured, unable to walk on her own, and the journey ahead was treacherous. As he hoisted her onto his back, the weight of her body felt strangely light, as though she was no heavier than a feather. Yet, the burden of responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. As they trudged forward, Ethan found himself constantly glancing at Lyra, trying to gauge how much further she could go. Every step he took across the shifting rocks, every loose stone beneath his boots, reminded him of how fragile their mission was. He had survived wars, storms, and countless challenges, but nothing compared to this. The unknown. The feeling of carrying someone who wasn't just a stranger, but an alien. The wind howled across the barren landscape, carrying with it a sense of unease. The shale crunched beneath Ethan's boots, sending echoes across the vast emptiness. Despite the harshness of the environment, Ethan noticed something. A soft gesture, almost imperceptible, from Lyra. She reached up with her delicate hand and gently touched his arm. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, Ethan realized that despite their differences, there was a connection between them. She wasn't just an alien he had to save. She was someone who, despite her weakness, still had the strength to offer a gesture of kindness. That gesture, that quiet act of compassion, changed something inside Ethan. It reminded him that victory wasn't just about surviving the physical hardships of the journey. It was about the silent victories that lay in the smallest acts of kindness, the moments of understanding that transcended species, that spoke louder than words. The wind picked up as Ethan continued to trek across the loose shale, his boots slipping slightly with every step. Lyra, still cradled in his arms, was surprisingly calm. Despite the harshness of the environment and the uncertainty of the journey ahead, she had yet to utter a word, but there was a sense of trust between them, something Ethan couldn't quite explain. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ethan kept his focus on the ground beneath him, stepping carefully over the uneven terrain. His mind kept drifting back to the moment when he first met Lyra, when everything had seemed so much simpler. He had been briefed on the mission: rescue the alien girl and bring her to the designated safe zone. But when he had seen her for the first time, something inside him had shifted. She was not just a mission. She was someone who needed help, someone who didn't deserve to be in the situation she was in. Her vulnerability made her more human in his eyes than anything else. As the hours passed, the landscape began to shift. The loose shale gave way to rocky outcrops, and the sky above them grew darker, as if warning them of the dangers that lay ahead. Ethan felt the weight of his responsibility grow heavier. Not only was he carrying an alien, but he was also carrying the hopes of an entire mission, one that had been entrusted to him by people who didn't fully understand the complexity of what he was up against. As they continued, Ethan noticed Lyra shifting slightly in his arms, her eyes opening for the first time in hours. Her gaze locked onto his, and for a brief moment, It felt as though time stood still. There was something in her eyes, something deep and ancient. It wasn't fear, nor was it pain. It was understanding. Ethan wasn't sure if it was a gift of her species, but in that moment, he could feel the weight of her past, the burden she carried, and the hope she placed in him. Lyra's hand, though still weak, gently rested on his shoulder, her fingers barely touching his skin. It wasn't a gesture of weakness, but one of connection. Ethan, despite his doubts and fears, felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had always been the one to face adversity head-on, to rely on his instincts. But with Lyra, it was different. He was no longer just a protector. He was a bridge between two worlds, two species, two beings who could have remained forever disconnected. As they moved forward, the terrain grew more treacherous. Large boulders loomed ahead, and Ethan's steps became more cautious. He glanced down at Lyra once again. She hadn't said a word, but her presence was undeniable. It was as though her quiet strength was giving him the courage to push on, to keep moving, no matter how difficult it became. The wind howled again, and a cloud of dust swept across the landscape, momentarily blurring his vision. He could feel his energy beginning to wane, but he refused to stop. Lyra's quiet companionship, the soft touch of her hand, was all the motivation he needed. They couldn't turn back now. There was no going back, only forward. They were in this together, and that thought alone made every step worth it. The terrain was getting more unforgiving with each step. The rocks were now larger, more jagged, and the loose shale beneath Ethan's boots was replaced by treacherous, uneven ground. Every step he took seemed like it could be his last. The wind howled, a constant reminder that they were far from any shelter. But Ethan refused to let the harsh conditions break his resolve. He had a mission, and more importantly, he had Lyra. Her presence, though silent, was a comfort to him. It was hard to explain, but there was something in the way she rested in his arms that made him feel like he wasn't alone. Even without words, Lyra communicated. Her small, gentle breaths were a steady rhythm that gave him a sense of peace in the chaos around them. As they continued, Ethan's thoughts drifted once again to their journey. He had been trained for many types of survival situations, but none had prepared him for this. None had prepared him for her. She was different, and he wasn't sure if it was because she was alien or because there was something more human about her than he had anticipated. Lyra was fragile, yes, but there was a strength to her that Ethan couldn't quite place. It was as if, despite her condition, she was somehow more resilient than he was. Perhaps it was the bond they were forming, or maybe it was something in the way she had looked at him earlier, like she understood him in ways that no one ever had. He had never expected a mission like this, never imagined that he would be carrying an alien through an alien landscape, yet here he was. And despite the unfamiliarity of the situation, he felt oddly at peace. The longer he carried her, the more he began to realize that their connection was not just about the mission. It was about something deeper, something that transcended their differences. There was a bond between them that was born from shared silence, shared understanding. Lyra stirred slightly in his arms, and Ethan paused, looking down at her. Her eyes were open again, her gaze still distant, but somehow more focused this time. The glow in her eyes flickered softly, as though she was trying to communicate something. Ethan slowed his pace, giving her a moment. She might have been an alien, but in that moment, she was simply a being, vulnerable, tired, yet still strong. The landscape around them had changed once again. The harsh winds were beginning to calm, and the earth beneath his feet felt a little firmer. It was a small change, but it gave Ethan a flicker of hope. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like they were getting closer to something. Maybe it was the shelter they sought, or maybe it was the understanding they were both starting to share. He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. The journey ahead, no matter how difficult, was something they would face together. Ethan wasn't just carrying Lyra anymore. He was carrying the hope of something greater. He took a deep breath and continued walking, each step feeling more purposeful than the last. With Lyra by his side, he knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The landscape ahead seemed to open up, revealing a distant mountain range that glimmered faintly in the morning light. Ethan felt a strange sense of relief, though he knew better than to get his hopes up too soon. The journey had been long, and the environment had already proven how quickly things could change. Yet, there was something about the view that felt different, something that sparked a flicker of optimism deep within him. He adjusted his grip on Lyra, making sure she was secure in his arms. Her presence, though quiet, had become a source of strength for him. It was as if she had somehow given him a reason to keep going, despite the challenges they faced. Her soft breathing was a constant reminder that they were both in this together. As they moved forward, Ethan's mind wandered again, this time not to the mission at hand, but to Lyra herself. He had never known an alien before, never had reason to even consider the idea of encountering one. Yet here she was, so fragile and strong at the same time. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she wasn't just an alien. She was a being, just like him. A creature who had known pain, suffering, and hope. It was easy to forget that when faced with the vastness of space and the strangeness of a world so far removed from his own. But Lyra had reminded him that the differences between them weren't as important as the shared experience of survival. A sudden gust of wind made him pause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to rest. He found a large rock and gently sat down, lowering Lyra so that her back rested against it. He checked on her carefully, still amazed at how little she weighed despite her strange appearance. The quiet was comforting, and for a few minutes, Ethan allowed himself to simply breathe. It was a moment of calm amidst the storm, a brief respite before continuing the long journey ahead. As he sat there, Lyra stirred, her eyes opening once again. They met his gaze, and this time, there was something different. A silent understanding passed between them, as if she could sense his fatigue and offered him a moment of peace. He felt a strange warmth spread through him, a reminder that they were not alone in this vast, alien world. The wind died down, and for the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to close his eyes and just listen. The sound of the wind, the rustle of the rocks, and even the soft hum of Lyra's presence filled the air. It was a sound that felt right. After a moment, Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of his mission pressing on him once again. He had to keep moving, had to get Lyra to safety, no matter how difficult the journey. But as he lifted her once more into his arms, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing this together, about showing Lyra that she wasn't just a mission, she was a companion. And with that thought, he set off once again, stepping forward with a quiet determination, knowing that every step they took was one closer to hope. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain as Ethan continued his journey with Lyra. The wind had calmed for now, but the air was still thick with the weight of the silence. Every step Ethan took felt deliberate, each movement calculated to avoid the loose rocks and uneven ground that had made this journey so treacherous. The exhaustion was beginning to catch up with him. His muscles ached from carrying Lyra for so long, and his mind struggled to keep focus. Yet, despite his growing fatigue, he couldn't afford to stop. He had made a promise to himself, and to her, that he would see this mission through. Lyra remained as silent as ever, her head resting against his chest. Ethan couldn't help but glance at her every few minutes, checking to make sure she was still okay. Her delicate features remained calm, though he could see the faintest signs of weariness in her eyes. It was hard to believe how much she had been through already. The alien girl, who had seemed so distant and fragile at first, now felt like an inseparable part of this journey. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing mile, and Ethan found that he no longer saw her as a mission. She wasn't just an alien he had to protect. She was someone he genuinely cared for. There was a shift inside him, a realization that this journey was about more than just survival. It was about connection. And no matter how impossible the task seemed, he was determined to see it through. As they moved forward, the landscape started to change once again. The rocky outcrops were replaced by an open valley, the ground softer beneath his feet. In the distance, Ethan could see what looked like the remnants of some kind of structure, perhaps a safe zone, or a shelter that could provide refuge. His heart quickened at the sight. It was the first sign of hope they had seen in days. The thought of reaching it kept him going, even as his body screamed for rest. The valley stretched out before them, a vast expanse of dry earth and scattered vegetation. It was a stark contrast to the harsh, jagged landscape they had just crossed. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to imagine what it would feel like to finally rest, to put down the weight he had been carrying for so long, both physically and mentally. He could almost hear the sound of a safe place, quiet, peaceful, and free from the relentless struggle of the journey. But the moment of peace was fleeting. The ground beneath them shifted again, and Ethan stumbled, nearly losing his footing. He regained his balance quickly, but the misstep reminded him how fragile their situation still was. There was no room for mistakes. He couldn't afford to slip up, not when they were so close. He glanced down at Lyra once more, the gentle pressure of her hand on his arm offering him a sense of calm. She was depending on him, and in that moment, Ethan realized something important. It wasn't just the mission that kept him moving, it was her. It was the understanding they shared, the connection they had forged in the midst of hardship. They had come so far together, and no matter what lay ahead, they would face it side by side. With that thought, Ethan pushed forward once again, his steps more determined than ever. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. The safe zone was closer now, its silhouette more distinct against the dimming sky. Ethan's heart quickened as the realization hit him. They were almost there. The long days of travel, the endless hours spent navigating the harsh terrain, all of it was about to end. The weight of the journey seemed to lift slightly as his eyes locked onto the distant structure. He adjusted his grip on Lyra, making sure she was still secure, and continued forward. His body ached, his muscles sore from the constant strain, but his determination to reach that shelter pushed him on. The valley stretched out before them like a welcoming embrace, its soft earth beneath their feet providing some relief after the jagged rocks they had crossed. As he moved, he couldn't help but glance down at Lyra. Her eyes were closed now, and her breathing, though steady, seemed slower than before. There was a subtle fragility in her stillness that made Ethan's chest tighten. She had been so resilient, so strong, but he could see the toll the journey had taken on her. Her soft, pale skin was almost translucent in the fading light, and her once vibrant silver hair had lost some of its shine. Ethan's resolve hardened. He couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. The safe zone was only a few more miles away, but those last few miles felt like a lifetime. The sky had darkened completely, the stars now visible above them, but the temperature was dropping rapidly. Ethan could feel the chill in the air, biting at his skin, but he knew that the shelter ahead would provide warmth and safety. It was within reach. The wind, though no longer howling, carried a sense of finality with it, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for them to arrive. The landscape had softened, but it still held its dangers. The ground was uneven, and Ethan had to step carefully, making sure not to stumble as his feet sank slightly into the soft earth. With each step, the structure grew larger, more defined. It was a faint outline at first, but now Ethan could see it clearly, a small, makeshift shelter, a place that promised refuge. He was almost there. But then, just as he thought they were safe, disaster struck. Lyra shifted in his arms, a sharp intake of breath followed by a soft gasp. Ethan froze. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest as he looked down at her. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, her gaze locked with his. There was something in her eyes, something distant, almost as if she were fading. Ethan's pulse quickened, and a cold wave of panic washed over him. She couldn't be. No, he refused to believe it. Lyra, the alien girl who had come to mean so much to him, was slipping. Her strength, so unwavering up until now, seemed to be fading. He had to act fast. There was no time to waste. Without thinking, he began moving again, faster this time, desperation fueling his every step. The shelter was within sight, just ahead, but Lyra's weakening form made every second feel like an eternity. Ethan pushed forward, determined to reach her before it was too late. She had to make it. He couldn't lose her now, not after everything they had been through. With each step, he whispered her name, though he knew she could barely hear him. Lyra, stay with me. His voice was hoarse, but he didn't care. He couldn't let go of the hope that they would make it. The shelter was so close, and yet, in that moment, everything seemed uncertain. He couldn't afford to lose her now. He had promised. The distance between them and safety seemed to stretch out infinitely, but Ethan's steps were steady. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had made it this far. He wasn't going to let the journey end like this. Not now. Not when they were so close. The shelter was finally in reach, the faint outline now a solid structure, a place of refuge that seemed to promise safety. Ethan's pulse raced as he pushed forward, every step now fueled by a raw urgency he hadn't felt until now. His arms ached, and sweat dripped down his face despite the chill in the air. Lyra's condition had worsened, and he couldn't shake the panic that clung to him like a heavy fog. Her breath was shallow, her grip on him weak. Her body was so light now, so fragile, it was as though she were becoming a part of the air itself. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest, each beat a reminder of what he stood to lose. He had carried her this far. He couldn't fail now. The shelter was only a few hundred feet away, the walls now more distinct under the pale light of the stars. It seemed to glow softly, an oasis of hope in the vast, empty landscape. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, his mind racing with the thought of what would happen if he didn't make it in time. The wind had calmed, but the cold was relentless, gnawing at his skin. Lyra's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her eyes fluttered open again, and for a moment, she looked directly at him. There was a sadness in her gaze, a kind of resignation that twisted in Ethan's chest. He had seen it before in the eyes of those who knew their time was running out, but he refused to believe it. She couldn't give up now, not when they were so close. He refused to let her go. With a renewed surge of determination, he quickened his pace. The shelter was right ahead. He could see it now, its rough exterior bathed in the faint glow of the stars. It was closer than ever, just within reach, but it felt as if the universe was testing him. Each step forward seemed to take an eternity. He could feel his strength waning, his energy drained, but there was no turning back. He had made it this far, and nothing, not even the overwhelming weight of exhaustion, could stop him now. Lyra's hand, once gently resting on his arm, had gone limp. Panic surged through him again, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to let fear take over. Not now. Not when they were so close to safety. As he approached the shelter, the entrance came into focus, the shadows around it growing deeper. There was a momentary flash of doubt in Ethan's mind. What if it wasn't safe? What if it was just an illusion, another cruel twist of fate? But he shoved those thoughts aside. They had come this far, and he refused to stop now. He reached the entrance, nearly collapsing as he finally crossed the threshold. Inside, the warmth hit him instantly, the contrast between the cold air outside and the heat inside a relief. Ethan lowered Lyra gently to the ground, his hands shaking as he adjusted her. The shelter was small, simple, but it was all they needed for now. His eyes darted around, taking in the sparse surroundings. Nothing extravagant, just a few basic supplies scattered around the walls. He didn't care about any of it. All that mattered was getting Lyra the help she needed. He knelt beside her, feeling for her pulse, his heart pounding in his ears. It was weak, faint, but it was still there. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. She wasn't gone. Not yet. He had made it. They had made it. The shelter, the warmth, the safety, it was all real. But now, it was up to him to keep her alive. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but he would do everything he could to make sure they both survived. For the first time in days, Ethan allowed himself to rest, even if only for a moment. The journey wasn't over yet, but they had made it through the hardest part. And for that, he was thankful. For that, he would fight with everything he had. Inside the shelter, the air was warmer, but the sense of urgency never left Ethan. He had set Lyra down on a small, makeshift bed of blankets and tried to make her as comfortable as possible, though he could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mix of exhaustion and worry. The faint light from the entrance cast shadows on the simple, sparse interior, but it was enough to reveal the desperate need for rest. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he checked on Lyra again. Her condition was still fragile, but she was alive. That was all that mattered in that moment. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, and her pulse, though weak, was still there. Ethan sat beside her, his gaze never leaving her face. There was so much he didn't know about her, so much he still hadn't learned. But there was one thing that was certain. She had become someone important to him, someone he needed to protect, someone whose survival depended on him. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. What now? What should he do? He had no medical training, no idea how to treat whatever illness or injury had brought Lyra to the brink. He had no time to waste. His eyes scanned the shelter, looking for anything that might help, but all he saw were the bare necessities. A few scattered supplies, water, dried food, some blankets, and that was all. There had to be something he could do. His eyes landed on the water, and the smallest glimmer of an idea formed in his mind. He quickly grabbed one of the bottles and brought it to Lyra's lips. He gently coaxed her to drink, but her eyes fluttered open briefly, a weak hand reaching out to stop him. Ethan froze, uncertainty flooding him again. "Lyra, can you hear me?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp. She didn't respond with words, but the faintest movement of her hand seemed to indicate that she understood. The small, silent exchange left him with a deep ache in his chest. She was so far from home, so far from anything she had known, and yet, here she was, still fighting. Ethan knew what he had to do. There was no guarantee that Lyra would survive through the night, but he would be there, by her side, until the very end. He wouldn't abandon her. He couldn't. The thought of losing her was unbearable, but he knew that every moment was a fight, her fight, and his. He could feel the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, but he wouldn't falter. There had been many times in his life where he had been on his own, where survival depended only on his skills and his instincts. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about doing what he could to save someone who had no one else, someone who had put her trust in him when she didn't even know him. And with that, a quiet resolve settled within him. He would do whatever it took. He gently placed a hand on Lyra's forehead, the coolness of her skin a stark reminder of how much she had endured. She was still breathing, still holding on, and for the first time since they had begun this journey, Ethan allowed himself a fleeting moment of hope. He wouldn't stop fighting. Not for her, not for himself, not for the promise of a better future. There was still time. There had to be. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Lyra, the silence in the shelter deepening as the minutes stretched on. The only sound was the gentle rustle of the blankets, the soft crackle of a small fire burning in the corner. In this quiet, in this stillness, he found a moment of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The night passed in a blur of uncertain moments. Ethan sat beside Lyra, never leaving her side, keeping watch over her as she lay still, her breathing still faint but steady. He didn't dare close his eyes, afraid that if he did, she might slip away in the silence. The shelter, small as it was, had offered them warmth and protection from the elements outside, but it couldn't shield them from the weight of the uncertainty that hung in the air. Ethan's mind raced. How long would she last? Was there something more he could do to help her? He had tried everything he could think of, water, blankets, warmth, but nothing seemed to be enough. Lyra's body remained unnaturally cold to the touch, and her pulse, though faint, was still there, reminding him that she was holding on. He felt a deep sense of helplessness. She had trusted him, and now, as much as he wished to help her, there was nothing more he could offer but his presence. That presence seemed to be the one thing that kept her tethered to life. As the hours stretched on, the fire in the corner of the shelter began to burn lower, the warmth it provided fading, but Ethan refused to leave the spot by her side. His body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the strain of carrying her and from the lack of rest, but his mind remained focused on her. She was the one thing that mattered now. No amount of fatigue, no physical pain could take his attention away from her. The quiet of the shelter was broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire and the rhythmic sound of Lyra's breathing. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the entrance, something shifted. Lyra's hand, which had been lying limp at her side, moved ever so slightly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough. He leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. As he watched her, her eyes fluttered open, the faint glow that had dimmed in her pupils now flickering back to life. She looked up at him, her gaze soft but filled with something he hadn't seen in days, awareness. Lyra was awake. Ethan didn't know what to say, or even if she could speak yet. His mind was overwhelmed with relief, with disbelief that she had made it through the night. Slowly, almost as if she was testing her own strength, Lyra lifted her hand and reached out to him. Her fingers brushed against his arm, and the simple gesture filled him with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was alive. She was still with him. Ethan smiled, The first true smile he had given since the moment they set foot in this strange world together. "Lyra," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you made it." She didn't speak, but the faintest of nods from her told him everything he needed to know. She was still fighting. They both were. The journey was far from over, but in that moment, Ethan knew something had shifted between them. They had crossed a line that neither of them could turn back from. The bond they shared now was stronger than the desperation that had driven them to this point. It was a bond forged in survival, in shared hardship, and in a quiet understanding that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. Lyra's recovery wouldn't be immediate. She was weak, fragile, but the spark of life that had returned to her eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. And neither was he. There was still hope, still a chance for a future, for a new beginning. Ethan knew the road ahead would be just as difficult as the one they had already traveled. But for the first time in days, he felt the smallest flicker of hope ignite within him. They had made it this far. They could make it further. Together.